Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. This is MPAC's third market intelligence event for Ontario Realtors, and I'm so happy to welcome back two of our industry partners, Shaun Cathcart from Korea and Jason Mercer from the Toronto Real Estate Board. They're going to be giving presentations later on in the session, and I'm very excited to have our very own president and CEO, Nicole McNeill, who has taken the time to join us again this year. Good morning, Nicole.
Good morning, Chris. And thank you again for hosting. Really looking forward to today's discussion and can't wait to share some of the exciting things that we have at MPAC that we've been up to.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's been a busy year. So just a few housekeeping items just before we begin. Just to let you know, we're recording this session and we'll be sharing it with you along with the presentations later on this week. And we also have our real estate team in the background monitoring questions during the presentation. So to submit a question, there's a question mark on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar window. And they may get back to you in a chat, and then we'll be compiling questions for the end of the presentation after Shaun and Jason have finished. And lastly, before I turn things over to Nicole, I'd just like to thank everyone on the call, the Ontario Real Estate Board's brokerages, for all the support we've received over the last year. As you know, there's been a lot of changes, and we introduced our new propertyline platform last October. And it was a significant upgrade from the previous version. We have an enhanced interface, better search parameters, and we redesigned all our reports. And earlier this month, we released 3 exciting new features. So measuring tools were brought into play. A property type layer, which you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner. This is a really neat feature. This was actually a request from Jason Mercer that allows you to have see the different property types. So res, are you backing onto commercial, industrial, etc. And then we also introduced, again, it was at the request of Jason, a assessment detail report, view tab. So if your board has licensed the enhanced package, you don't need to go through the checkout report, checkout process, or go to the Geo Warehouse. There's a assessment details tab where you can view the assessment details quickly and print them. So we've had some great feedback so far. And what's coming next, we're working with Realm and CoreLogic's team on both further integrating the assessment data directly into your MLS platforms. So hopefully we'll have something to roll out shortly. And this 2023 has been an extremely busy year. We haven't had a busier year that I can recall. So far this year, we've had 8,000 realtors attend our free training sessions, whether it be through a webinar or we also do in-person training. And we've attended many industry events, more than we have obviously in the last few years. So we've seen a lot of you at the Buzz conference. We saw Jason or Shaun in Korea. The team was at the Niagara Tech Day and Right at Home and Home Life events. And most recently, in the last 2 weeks ago, we were at Realtor Quest, which I think there was about 11,000 realtors that attended, Jason. So it was a great event, really exciting, and happy to be back in person.
Amazing, lots of good developments, Chris. I love the new interface, and it sounds like we have to send all our requests to Jason. He's got some pull in order to to make those happen. Chris, how was Realtor Quest? I was really disappointed. I was out of country. I wasn't able to go. How did it go for you guys?
Yeah, it was fantastic. So we have some new team members that hadn't experienced the Realtor Quest, and Max and Mark was saying, guys, I know you've been to other events, but you haven't seen anything like this with just the amount of attendees. So very exciting. Our team obviously has enjoyed doing the webinars, and they've been very successful over the last few years. But the face-to-face, in-person training that we're doing on all the boards and brokerages at their request, it just provides a much better dynamic, and our team's a lot happier seeing people face-to-face rather than talking into the camera. Maybe we can figure something out next year on how we could do this event live.
Well, it's funny you said that because I was joking this morning with the other panelists. I haven't done a go-to meeting in a while. It feels like everything's back to in person, but one of the things we've learned through this pandemic are these virtual opportunities are still good opportunities. So it's nice that we can double down on in person when we need to, but also facilitate you know, a larger area and more accessible for many people virtually. What are the biggest topics, Chris? You said you had a new team. They're out there going all these things. What are some of the hot topics that people are asking?
So obviously, you know, we're getting questions about the new property line application, how to use the assessment data. Obviously, always questions about MPAC square footage, and our AVM reports are our fastest growing report. But the number one question we're getting, and we're all hearing it, is MPAC. Got some background noise there. Number one question is, when's the next reassessment? And what's going to happen to my property taxes when this happens?
Well, before we go there, whoever was just playing this Succession, I've not seen the season finale yet, so hopefully that will end and there won't be any spoilers yet. So, but no, Chris, that is the number one question. I know right across the province. I've been traveling all throughout Northern Ontario at Northern municipal conferences, and it's the number one question. And the answer is we're still status quo. We do not know when the province will announce the next reassessment. So we don't have a date. We're still working off Jan 1, 2019 or 2016 values, but we're working hard internally to make sure that we're ready as soon as the province does make that announcement.
So Nicole, it might be a good idea to just share with everyone how we're, our staff and our teams are trying to remain ready and be on call for when that does happen.
Absolutely. So as a reminder for everyone in Ontario, we have 5.6 million properties across the province, and our staff are responsible for maintaining and managing the assessment and classification of each and every single one. It ranges from single family homes to commercial buildings, industrial factories, and farmland. And we don't just assess properties every few years. What we do is we're continually working to keep our property inventory up to date and continue to evaluate new properties, and we've all seen there's new properties, and changes to existing ones happening in real time. So we are the second largest assessment jurisdiction in the world, but we're actually the largest for a continuously updated database. So we're regularly processing building permits. We're forecasting new assessment for our municipal partners. And what we've been doing is using this pause to evaluate all of our processes and in-house technology to identify and improve the way we work with all of our stakeholders across Ontario, whether you be property owners, municipalities, industry groups, and so on. And a good example, what you're seeing in this space is propertyline. So we've been continuing to explore new and innovative ways to share our Ontario's property data. This includes conducting market research on new data report products, as well as working with key organizations to launch new initiatives to better serve all of our property owners in Ontario. So for example, we've seen a lot of engagement with the assessment and taxation education campaign we launched last year in partnership with the Ministry of Finance. So we know people are hungry for all this information. And by monitoring all of our outreach through media and new channels, we've been able to identify information gaps that may exist and better respond to the needs of all of these stakeholders. And again, this includes municipalities, property owners, businesses, and of course, all of you, the realtors who are on this call.
Yeah, I know, it's great. And realtors, you know, obviously we all love statistics and data. And that's why we've, inside of Propertyline, for those of you who registered, we've got this Realtor Insights section where you're able to see our latest press releases on statistics, etc. You can register for our training team. You can see our team below, Mark, Max, and Krista. And yeah, no, it's just a area that we'll keep updating. And we've got a new video up there that we released recently. So explains the difference between the relationship between property assessment and municipal taxes.
That's it. Is that the landing page? Because I see the link to the video right there. So that's good news if
Yeah,
that's on the landing page. It's a very confusing concept. So I encourage everyone to go in and look at the difference between your assessment and then your municipal taxes.
Yeah.
So maybe
good.
on that note, I think we have something, don't we have like a poll? We're trying something new this year. It's tough to compete with Shaun and Jason because they always have such great graphics and great analysis. But this year we thought we would do a little bit of a poll of a myth versus fact. And as you can see, the question on the screen here is, if a property's assessment value doubles when a reassessment occurs, will the property taxes double as well?
My sales team's hoping they get this right, because this is part of their training.
Their onboarding. Okay, there we go. Drum roll. It is a myth. Okay, so we have 92%. So a lot of people are realizing that that is not the case. Absolutely. So maybe we could just clarify a little bit about valuation and property taxes.
Yeah, and it's important. I'm glad to see obviously realtors understand this, because a lot of times you are dealing with first-time home buyers in the front line before they even talk to us. So it's helpful for us that you guys can explain this for us.
Absolutely. So we're often asked the same thing. Like one of the questions, as I mentioned before, working off of 2016, is why are property assessments so low? And the most important thing to understand is that a property's assessed value is not the same as a property's market value today. And that's because the current legislation directs us to value the property based on what it was worth in 2016. The assessed value of a home represents the total value of the lot, the structure, and in relation to other properties within that area.
Right. And as you mentioned, we're still legislated by the province to calculate the assessments based on the 2016 valuation date. One question we do get a lot, Nicole, is does this apply to new homes and new constructions?
It does, and I know that that creates a lot of confusion. So what happens is assessors will have to evaluate new construction. So if you can look out, I'm facing Pickering here, you can see lots of cranes in behind me there. But that, even when people move in, it's all based on what that property's criteria would have been relative to 2016. So the current value assessment that we are using in our database is based on 2016 data.
All right, so we've covered, there's no reassessment that has been announced yet. The assessments are low because we've got the 2016 valuation data as per the legislation. But now for the big one. When the reassessment occurs, everyone wants to know what's going to happen to their assessed values and their taxes when we finally do get a date and update the provincial database.
Absolutely. Well, good news is we saw in the poll, 92% realize that if your property value doubles, your taxes will not double. So that is the good news. So if generally what happens, and I do encourage everyone to watch that video because it is helpful, but if a property's value has gone up at the same rate as others in your area and the budget in your municipality stays the same, you're not likely to see any impact on your property taxes after reassessment, because it is a net zero game. Municipalities are not allowed to profit off the assessment. They have to balance their budget. So that's really, it's the relative value of your home within the municipality and neighborhoods that make the difference.
Yeah, it's one of the only times you want to be average or below average when there's a reassessment. So, you know, as Nicole said, it's all relative to the total assessment base and the municipal budget needs.
Absolutely. So if your property's value has gone up since 2016, and no doubt across Ontario it has, but not as much as similar neighboring properties, you might actually see a decrease in taxes. The same goes for an increase if you're above the average of the neighborhood assessment value. But again, it depends on the municipal budget staying the same, as they control the tax rates at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. So I think this is a new slide we've recently seen, and I think you'll see our real estate team incorporate this into our customized realtor presentations. So thanks for that clarification, Nicole.
Absolutely. Now, Chris, you also mentioned that you're receiving many questions about our AVM products, and that actually does move us back to market value. So can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So our AVM reports, they're available in our property line application, and we've had these in the marketplace for over 20 years, and they were originally designed for the mortgage insurers and the financial institutions. The first client was when GE came to Canada to compete with CMHC in the mortgage insurance, and they said to us, we need a real-time market value because we need to approve the mortgage insurance applications in less than a minute. So we were successful. At the time, we focused on Ontario, and then they asked us to go across the country and come up with a national solution. So right now, we value every property in Ontario on a weekly basis, and the rest of the province, we've got 85% of Canada covered, we value on a monthly basis. And what the realtors are using this for is, gone are the days, I grew up from a family of realtors where the only database was the MLS books that were released every month that I had stacks in my house, and you went through and looked at the listings. But this is an unbiased second opinion of value, and it's great to share with a homeowner who might still think that their home is worth what it was at the peak of the pandemic, as well as it can assist you. The reports include comparable sales. When you're doing your own CMA, here's some additional sales, as well as the structural details that go with it. So it is the fastest growing report amongst the Ontario realtors as they become educated on it. And we do have a webinar that focuses specifically on the AVM and how you can use it in your practice. So now, special announcement here. So as a way to thank everyone for attending today, we're going to give everyone who completes the poll at the end of the presentations, the survey. We're going to give you a free AVM comparable report. So what'll happen is once you complete that poll, you'll get a follow-up email from us within a couple days with a coupon code to go into Propertyline and get a free report. It's a $40 value just for completing the survey.
That's amazing. So, Nicole, I'm excited about this. As you know, Chris, I think there's a lot of value, and there's so many times, and when you look at it for $30 or $40, you get a lot of detailed information on the property comparables and where it's at relative to today's value.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of questions and a lot of good conversations at the industry events about the AVM products. So why don't we move into the building permits, our next section, Nicole, if you can give us some good insights.
Yeah, I know we have a lot of data here, so I'm excited to share that some of our property insights from our latest building permit statistics. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, we're continuously updating our database. So all of the changes that are happening to properties, we're capturing them every year. And just as an example, we process and analyze over 300,000 building permits across the province. And permits are essential because they trigger us to review changes in a property, and it's valuable input as we prepare for the next assessment update. In 2022, we processed just over 108,000 residential building permits, including 48,000 for new residential homes, so that new construction that we were talking about. The increase, all of that, when you add it up at the end of the year, is an increase in the growth of value in Ontario of $38 billion that we added last year, and we're actually on track this year to add more than $40 billion in 2023. When we look at this data and we compare it throughout the years, we're able to gauge not only the latest trends, such as garage renovations and home improvements, we can use this data to also identify some of the social economic behaviors that I'm sure many people on this call are experts in. So for example, 2019, it remains the highest year for building permits. In 2022, we actually saw a bit of a decrease in total permits for the first time, which was about 11% less than activity in 2021. When we dive a little bit deeper into the details and we look at the home improvement permits year over year, we saw a decrease from 2021. We processed just over 63,000, so about 9.3% less than what was issued in the previous year. The same goes for additions, renovations, and alteration permits. We saw just over 37,000 processed in 2022, which was just under 4% less than what we saw in 2021. So as much as it discontents me to still be speaking about the pandemic, what we believe we're seeing is a shift in permits, in partial due to the restrictions being lifted on COVID-19, and homeowners are now gravitating back towards more experiences, including travel, whereas we all know they were really focusing on their homes in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, and imagine the interest rate increases is having an effect on homeowners looking to borrow for doing some additions and renos.
Absolutely, but I'm sure the market discussions with the real estate experts on the line are also going to be sharing some of those correlations with us.
For sure.
Couple more things. Everyone loves a pool here in Ontario. So in 2022, we received just over 6,600 permits for pool installations. I often wonder how many of that got shifted into the next year, because as you know, it was such a long waiting list, and I'm sure we could all share pool horror stories. I know my sister went through a crazy reno, and I'm sure we all know someone who knows someone who went through that. But pool installations are still up there, and interestingly, the leader in pool renos was Ottawa, leading it at 780. So they were the top city for adding pools in 2022. Something new that we looked at this time go around was garages, and we processed almost the same amount of pools of garages. It was 6,000 that were processed last year. As I showed in a previous slide, both categories did decrease compared to 2021. But I'd like to pay, just like we did a little poll, we're going to do a little something fun and a bit of a multiple choice guessing game at see how many, which municipality do you think led the charge in deck permits in 2022? We'll see if anyone can guess this, because as much as we all love pools, we all love a nice deck, especially on a good weather day like today that we have.
I spent last weekend building a deck, my friend's place up in Apsley.
Yes. They, what did you get paid with beverages?
Yeah, I was a laborer. My daughter's boyfriend, he's a carpenter, so he was running point on the project.
Oh, okay.
So
he was telling you what to do.
I would fetch him beverages.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. Wow. Okay. At first, I thought they actually answered it right, but you know what? We did. Hamilton didn't come in, so that is the answer,
Yeah.
at 30%. So that's pretty good. Yeah. So just over in 2022, there was 8,200 deck permits, and Hamilton was the #1 at 572. You can see on the screen.
Yeah, it's quite a big increase. Like the next one was 374 in Ottawa, right? So go Hamilton.
I think everyone who finally got their pool installed then moved on to the deck after, but it took so long to get the pool installed.
All right, well, great information, Nicole. And just to remind everyone on the call that you do have access to building permit history in propertyline. So we do receive all the permits from the municipalities, and we've got a direct feed, and we do provide them on the residential detail report as well as our AVM reports if you want to see what we have on record. So Nicole, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Taking the time, especially, I know your schedule is crazy. And as you know, we all love data and statistics, and we look forward to continuing to provide information and market insights using our data in Ontario.
That's great. Thank you for having me, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of this webinar.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. All right, I'm really excited for our next two speakers, as we'll be hearing about what's going on in the market across the province and the country. First, I'd like to welcome our special guests, Shaun Cathcart and Jason Mercer. Shaun is the Canadian Real Estate Association's senior economist. He manages the production and distribution of Korea's national resale housing database. He's also in charge of market analysis, providing housing market intelligence and analytics materials to boards, associations, members, media, government, and other real estate industry stakeholders. Today, Shaun will be providing us with an overview of what's going on in the market right across the country. Shaun, why don't I turn it over to you?
Well, thanks, Chris. It's good to be back at this event. It's always fun. To have I don't often do audiences this big, so it's good to be able to reach out to this many people. The slideshow I've got for you today is one I've been doing sort of for the last month. So, go back 2 months, 3 months, it was very much about showing people the green shoots that were coming in this market. I said, this market is spooling up. We've had in our forecast since last year a recovery this year. The question was all along, is the Bank of Canada going to signal they're at the top and our price is going to stop falling? Because if I'm on the sidelines as a buyer, that's the dip I'm looking to buy. I don't want to get put on the street by another 400 basis points of rate hikes this year. And I don't want to buy a house that's falling by $10,000 in value every month. So once those two, it was really a matter of timing. We hit that milestone sort of around March, April, and right after the Easter weekend, as I'll show you in a minute, people came flooding off the sidelines, looking like more big numbers in May. But it's also, people are saying, I can't believe the resilience of this market, even with rates so high. And so today's slideshow is more about reminding everyone by zooming way out and looking at 50 years of data, the demographics underlying this, what we've been building or not building for these people that's got us into this situation, and looking at sort of 50 years of MLS data as well as our forecast, and saying, look, we've seen times in the past where we've had a housing boom like this. The mid to late 80s was one. The early 2000s was another, and now we were due for one, and we're in the middle of it right now. So where does it go from here? We can look to history as a guide, but also ask the question, is maybe this time different? So without further ado, I've got, I believe half an hour or so, 25 minutes, and I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to jump right in. And can someone, Chris, can you chime in and can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. You just see me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me.
There we go. Just a bit of a lag. So.
Oh, okay, good. So now you can see it.
We can see it.
PowerPoint. Okay, great. Let's go. All right. So the first thing I'm going to jump into, which I always do, is people who need somewhere to live. Is sort of the first question you need to ask when you think about housing demand, and why is it doing what it's doing? Sorry, there we go. So this is a graph of Canada's population by age group. So it's a histogram, okay? The blue is 50 years ago, the red is now, okay? And so this is what's known as a secular trend. So you can picture this thing moving through time. It doesn't stay static. It doesn't move back and forth. It's happening all around the world. It's basically a hockey stick of population that popped up in the 20th century that is now aging through time. It's going to be the biggest factor in politics, in healthcare, in geopolitics going forward. But today we're going to just use it to talk about what's going on in the housing market. So, the blue, you can see that's all the boomers there on the other. So those black bars are age 30 and 85. That denotes the common home ownership years. Before 30, it's really low. After 85, it sort of drops off. And in that middle, sort of middle age, when people tend to have their own place. And so what you can see is for the last 50, we started 50 years ago with half the population under 30. But now almost everyone's middle age, but we're not fully bracketed within that homeownership space yet. We're still moving into this problem or this challenge, call it. Here's your early, your sort of younger baby boomers. That was the first really big group of people born sort of in the 60s and the late 50s. And then you have your Gen X. That's what I am. That's why I'm so sarcastic. Then your millennials. That's the biggest group of them all, who've all just come through into their 30s and now 40s. Interesting thing about this group is they have not gone into the home ownership space like previous generations. So a lot of that is still pent up. People that are reaching now their late 30s and still looking to get into this market. And you got Gen Z coming up behind with some big numbers as well. But if you look on the other end, there's still very few people sort of going out the other end of this thing and giving all these great single family homes up. And so you hear millennials say, you know, I want to buy, you know, I had a condo, but I'm looking to buy something more like what I grew up in to raise a family. And the problem is that their parents, not only their parents still living in that thing, their grandparents might be too. And so you really need to be building to accommodate this 500, you know, more than 500,000 people a year that are turning 30. And so let's look at what we're building. So this is from CMHC, housing unit completions. And, you know, someone might say, oh, we're building at record levels. And yeah, that's true for like the last 3 months. That's not going to cut it. This has got to be an ongoing thing. And the reason I made this all blue is because the conversation in Canada, and it is really frustrating, is people will say, well, how many units are we building? Is it enough units or is it not enough units? What kind of deficit are we in for this number of units? And it's like, well, units of what is the question, right? And so if we put some color on this and look at housing types, the blue is your traditional big single detached home. Semis are in the orange. Gray is the row homes, your townhomes, and yellow is apartments. And what you see is in the last 10 years, that apartment space is blown out to now something like 60% of overall completions. In Toronto, Vancouver, it's like over 90. You know, your traditional, what's called the missing middle, which is what we really need, is the orange and the gray, which is still very much missing. That's why we still call it that 10 years on. I remember going to a TREB event about a decade ago where that was the big thing. And it was like, you know, eventually we'll be just calling it medium density housing, but we're not there yet. Now I talked about previous housing booms and how this one differs. And so the previous two were the mid to late 80s and the early 2000s. And so you can see what we did then. We built record numbers of single family homes. And, you know, supply hit a bottom. We went into a boom, but supply climbed back out of it and eventually, you know, balanced out. What we're doing this time is for 20 years, we built fewer and fewer single family homes, but we shot right through that missing middle that is a substitute good for the traditional single family home. It's a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, maybe it's a little taller and skinnier, and it certainly comes with a lot less land, a lot less lawn to mow, but it's a substitute. But we've shot right through into these apartments. A 1-bedroom apartment is not a substitute for a single family home. And if you were to alter this chart to just so that it would tell you how many bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage we're building, you'd find that we're not building nearly a record of actual what houses people. So that's one part of the problem. And you could get into a lot more detail about why we're in the situation we're in, but I'll just leave it at that for now. People that need somewhere to live, and in our housing stock, there is a mismatch of suitability and arguably allocation, with young families, growing families cramped into apartments, and you know, older folks like my parents, empty nesters in these big single family homes. It's not to say that they don't have a right to be there, but it is a mismatch of, you know, square footage and bedrooms and bathrooms compared to household size. All right, next, let's get into some MLS data and what's been going on of late. I should mention here that I'm going to focus on national data because this slideshow was already made and I've delivered it like 15 times in the last 3 weeks. So to change it to Ontario wouldn't really change the story. And I like to hit on these headline numbers anyway. Trust me, what's going on in Canada and these numbers is going on in Ontario, arguably to a bit more of a degree, and especially in Toronto, which has sort of been leading this. But I'll leave that to Jason to get into after this. Just headline, you can see what happened in April. That is one of the biggest month-over-month increases in home sales in Canada's history. You have to go back over the last 2 decades. The only time we've had increases in double digits in a single month was the rebound coming out of the COVID lockdowns and the rebound coming out of the financial crisis. So this is a really big rebound, but this is legit demand, not just coming back to normal, but flooding off the sidelines. As I said, because in my view, those important milestones of really the word is certainty. Certainty around interest rates, and certainty that I'm not buying making the biggest financial decision in my life and then gonna, be underwater and lose my down payment by the time I get the keys. And so we hit those milestones and people came off the sidelines. Now, during COVID, we developed these daily charts that I may have shown this group last year. Just quickly to let you know how to read this, it's a 7-day moving average, so it smooths out sort of weekends and weekdays. So we got the idea from how they track COVID, actually. And this helps us zoom right in on what's going on from day to day, especially times like this when we're at critical turning points. I would argue we're at a tipping point, not just a turning point was a couple months ago. But the way to read this is it basically goes from New Year's Day to New Year's Eve. So this is a typical year in the housing data of Canada. This is sales. The gray bars are a 5-year average that give us sort of a baseline. The blue is what happened last year. So you can see the strong start and then how it fell way below average very quickly in the mid-year. Even long before the Bank of Canada really got rolling, of course, bond markets were way out in front of what they were going to do. And so that impacted 5-year fixed rates quite strongly by about Canada Day and shut this thing down quite quickly. If you look at all those little divots that you see all along, that's all the stat holidays. So Family Day, March break, we just got hit by May 2-4, Canada Day, August long weekend, Thanksgiving, etc. So what you see here is that big jump in April sales overall for the month, 11.3%, which was almost a record, was all in the second half of the month. So you see that divot where it drops down, that's the Easter weekend, and all that strength was just in the last 2.5 weeks of that month. And so now what we've had is May, a full month of May running above average. So I'm expecting another really big number in May. This is where it went from, in the space of 2 months, from quite below average to a little below average to this is going to be possibly above average and another double-digit gain, I'm guessing. If this were 2 days from now, I could tell you, but we don't have that in just yet. So call it a mini forecast. This data is going to be coming out, I don't know what Toronto's going to do this week or next, but we'll start to see these numbers in the next few days. Now let's zoom way out from the daily data and look at 45 years of home sales. So the same data I've just shown you on a monthly seasonally adjusted basis, on a daily basis, and now on an annual basis over our entire history. Because I think you need to look at all of those to understand what's going on. On the far right, those two dark blue bars are our current forecast for 2023, which is forecast to be about in line with 2022, about 500,000 sales. Just to give you an idea of how that shakes out, 2 months ago, this number was annualized at 400. Just in April, it's jumped to 450. I think in May, it might jump to an annualized level of about 500. So we're on track to hit this forecast, but this forecast really did rely, even though it looks down, it really did rely on a big rebound starting this spring. So we probably aren't going to change it too much next time around. We might even have to revise it up depending on what happens in the next couple of months. But what you can see with sales is, and this underlies our mathematical modeling, is that it does follow sort of a society, the size of the population, the size of the housing stock over time. There's a trend under there, and it goes above and below. So again, I'm going to come back to our previous two housing booms, mid to late 80s, early 2000s. And how does that compare to where we are now? It doesn't look the same, right? And this one's been really choppy. You can see where it started off in 2015-16. That was the Lower Mainland and the Greater Golden Horseshoe really fired off and sort of shocked policymakers. And there was policies that came in that knocked that back quite dramatically. The stress tests sort of held it down for about 2 years, and then COVID gave it a big push. With everyone wanting to move and wanting a place of their own. It went through the roof, and now, of course, the inflation crisis we're in and the associated rate hikes knocking it back again. But make no mistake, we are in, and you can see how this spaces out over about 15 or 20 years. We were due for this, and we are in it right now. So what happens when you're in a housing boom? Well, over multiple years going into it, if sales are outpacing new listings, so if you go from a sales to new listings ratio of about 50 to about 60, and it stays there month after month after month, the overall stock of active listings, as I'm depicting here, the number of pins on the map gets drawn down and down and down and down. So for analysts that are looking at this data, we saw this coming a mile away. I often refer to that scene in the movie Austin Powers, where they run over the henchman with the steamroller, and he's like, no, and it's like, you know, we've been watching this develop since 2015, and so the idea that this just popped out of nowhere during COVID is wrong, and the idea that we're somehow gone out of it now is also wrong. So here's the number of active residential listings on all MLS systems across Canada at the end of every month over 25 years, seasonally adjusted. And you can see, you know, we have one example here historically of coming into one of these things in the early 2000s, following this trend down, down, down. And here's the one we've been watching from 2015. You see that, you know, obviously we're up a little bit from the all-time lows during COVID, but this is still historically low. So, you know, what happens then is when people jump off the sidelines, or people are waiting on the sidelines for new listings, because there's not that much out there kind of hanging around. And so the question is listings are getting pounced on these days. And the question for sellers is, how many offers do you think we're going to get? And I think that that's the tipping point we're at right now. Just to give you an idea of how steady these trends are, if you're not in the oil patch or in Vancouver and Toronto, this is active residential listings in Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, all added up. And you can see that you could basically watch this thing go up over, you know, 10, 15 years and back down over the last decade. You could draw that with a ruler. And so again, imagine that steamroller scene. We've been sort of watching this develop for a long time, and you can think about how long it might take to climb back out of it, if indeed we are going to. We are in a seller's market right now. Months of inventory. Same sort of thing. You can see that we have only, you know, the difference between a year ago and what's happened in the last year is we only just got back to sort of more of a mild seller's market, right? And now we've already turned the corner and going back down. I think this is going to go even lower in May, and so the market is definitely heating back up. See, it looks kind of like that early 2000s housing boom, but as of May, we might even be tighter than at any point back then. So obviously we're trending right now sort of somewhere in between the craziest seller's market of all time 15 months ago and what would be considered balanced. So not white hot, but probably still red hot. And here's the biggest issue that I see. This is new listings every month. So this is what we're sort of relying on to sort of replenish and build this market up, balance it out. We know that the demand is coming screaming off the sidelines. Are the sellers coming in with stuff for them to buy now too? Well, no, this thing has fallen off a cliff since last fall. It's actually, if you look at the history, quite aberrant. So this is probably the most dramatic thing going on in the data right now. It's why when I say we're at a tipping point, and I wonder to how much farther this thing could go back towards what we saw during COVID. This is one of the data points that really makes me think, you know, like, you know, this is going to get out of balance very quickly here again. And an interesting point was brought up at a thing I did last Thursday in the Q&A about how many people, existing owners, have these sweet fixed rates that, you know, if they did go out and buy something bigger, more expensive, and had to, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how all those rules work. I thought about calling Rob McClister last night, but it was a little late. You know, if you've got to blend that mortgage rate that's like the lowest you're ever going to get in your lifetime with rates where they are now, basically at the top, that maybe a lot of existing owners are going to say, yeah, you know what, maybe it's not the best time to do that. And so what you have is new listings at a 20-year low. So let's get to prices. How obviously when demand surges back, listings still very low. What do you think prices are going to do? This is the national MLS home price index that we seasonally adjust with StatCan. I always brag about how smooth it is. I think anyone else publishes anything this smooth. And when you've got data this smooth, you better believe that every month over month means exactly what you think it means. That's what prices are doing. And obviously what we saw in April was we saw between February and March prices stabilized, but they didn't just stabilize as some forecasters are thinking. They immediately turned the corner and went back up because, like I say, we never exited a red hot market. It just went on pause. And now we've hit the play button again. And I can tell you that the prelim HPI data for May came in yesterday morning, and we ran it through, you know, the annual review was in, so the data's been revised, and we were awaiting our new seasonal adjustment models for StatCan in the next day or two. But we did run it through our old model to get a good idea of what this is going to look like, and I can tell you that it's going to be another increase like we saw in April. And so what was that like? Well, there it is, 1.6%, and I believe that's revised up for in this latest iteration, and then May being that big again. It's not COVID level growth, but it's not far off. It's not Greater Golden Horseshoe in early 2017, but it's not far off, and it's certainly bigger than most of history. And so that is the market we are very suddenly back in right now. So here's our price forecast. We use the average for this because it goes back 45 years. The HPI doesn't. And you can see that we have a decline forecast for 2023. You know, when we first issued that forecast, the average price in Canada was down here. So that was very optimistic. And we were like, boy, this thing better rebound. Part of that was baked into that was if Toronto and Vancouver sales, not prices, but just the sales come back to more normal levels, that's going to interject a lot more expensive property transactions back into the sample, which will raise that without prices having to do anything. And of course, as you'll see from, I'm sure Jason will show us, that has happened, and Toronto and Vancouver have sort of been somewhat dominating this recovery. But now with prices also now rising and pushing this thing, legitimately individual prices of homes moving up, by April, the average price in Canada was already up here. So it's an increase of more than $100,000, mostly compositional, somewhat legit price growth, and that's going to continue. So now all of a sudden, within 3 months, this forecast is looking quite pessimistic, and we're probably going to have to chase it higher the next time around because things are changing so quickly. Now, since I have this up here, and I did this presentation for the Canadian Association of Business Economists last week, and since I had a bunch of data nerds, I thought, let's look back at this history and look at some of the stuff that I've been seeing over the many years I've been making this data that I think a lot of people aren't hip to. And so I talked about those two previous big price booms, right? Well, what do those look like compared to now? And how does that inform maybe how we can think about where we are in this current cycle, if it is a cycle? So here's 1984 to 89. And I know that it gets squished by the passage of time. It doesn't look that big, but that is a national average price of $75,000 to $150,000. It exactly doubled in 5 years, and then it went flat for 12. So it didn't do anything. So that cycle, prices in 5 years exactly doubled. I know some of you will say, because I know where you are, Toronto overshot. You know what Toronto did? They went from 100,000 to 250 and then sank back to 200. So in the fullness of time, the Toronto average prices also exactly doubled within that cycle. They just kind of overshot, kind of like what we did last year. Then the early 2000s, 5 years, 2002 to 2007, from 150 to 300, prices exactly doubled. And then, well, it didn't quite level off. It was the low interest rate era following the financial crisis, so it was able to sort of creep from 300 to 400. And then our current cycle, starting from 400. I remember talking to my colleagues back in 2017 and saying, okay, we know we're going into one of these things again. The last two prices exactly doubled. So we're starting at 400. Can the national average home price in Canada get, just for the average, not Toronto, not Vancouver, the average of all of Canada, get to $800,000? It seemed insane, right? And you can see that where our forecast is right now, that's pretty far beyond. But let's go back to our friend, the HPI, because this is annual data and it doesn't capture what's happening monthly. The HPI does, and it's very accurate. Here's your starting point, 400. Could we possibly get to 800? Well, surprise, we did last year. We've already been there. Arguably with rates at zero, basically, we got there, and the frenzy of the house search during COVID and the lowest inventory of all time, we got there too fast, and it was not sustainable at that time. It was sustained for sort of one late fall winter period, which is like a small amount of time at the slowest time of year, not enough to get it really established in people's minds. And then rates went through the roof. And so obviously we gave a lot of that back. We are now turning a corner. I think we'll be from the low 700s to about 735,000 by May. So, and that's with half the year still to go. Can we get to 800? I actually think we will. I think we'll get to 800 this year unless something crazy happens. And that's with rates probably not going down at all. Or if anything, maybe near the end of the year or at the beginning of next year. So I think you can get there. My question is it going to stop there this time? Because I don't know that this cycle is the same as previous ones. I think that this might be a secular change. You know, I heard someone on Reddit the other day gave a great analogy that I'm sort of using, stealing. You know, it's like 50 years ago, we had these, you know, big cohorts of people started to come into the space. And it's like playing a game of Monopoly where they started going around the board. And buying up properties and putting down houses. And you know, the longer you've been going around the board, the better you've done. But now we're at a point where these new entrants today, and you can hear them say this, it's like the board is full. It's like there's no more room for them to play in this game, unless we build. And of course, that's been one of the primary advocacy asks at CREA. Find ways to get more homes built, not just the status quo, but something big that's going to change this. But so what do I think over the next year? I think that this thing can keep creeping up, and then there's your 400 to 800 during this cycle. And then the question is, can it go higher? And I think it can. All right, let's talk interest rates quickly. So that's where the Bank of Canada's overnight rate is now. That's neutral. So, you know, once inflation's under control and they can sort of wind it back down to normal. Let's look at some expectations. So this is just a zoom in on that same thing. You know, when this whole tightening cycle started up, that was the expectation. We first saw this last March and went, holy cow, the bank's going to go all the way up to neutral. That's crazy. A month later, it looked like that. I was renewing my mortgage and my whole family had COVID. I said, I want a DocuSign today. I don't believe you're going to hold that rate for me. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, the rate was % higher. Of course, in the fullness of time, we got even higher. We're at 4.5 now. You know, before the banking crisis back in March of this year, the expectation was that they might do another hike, but then ultimately over 2024 and 2025, it's going to wind down towards that neutral level. Obviously, after that banking crisis, people were like, oh, and there was an announcement where markets were like, oh, they're going to cut this summer. And of course, the governor came out and was like, no, no, no. And then with the latest inflation print as well, sort of looking kind of sticky, it's moved back up. So maybe they do one more hike. But ultimately, the big picture here is that, you know, even this market is already going to be hot in 2023 with rates still way up at the top. And then what happens after that? Well, rates are going to start to come down. So all this pent up demand from first time homebuyers that are stuck on the sidelines now that are going to be able to come back into this space. And so if we don't start building, you know, that demand isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's going to keep coming. Now this is the sale to list price ratio for a good chunk of Canada, more than half, that we use as a proxy to see what's going on, every list price and then what it sells for. And you can see what's happened over the course of this year is that we've gone from, you know, houses that sit on the market for 20 days and take a $25,000 haircut to sell to ones that are probably getting a firm offer the day it goes on the market. And so the question is, are we at a tipping point here where people are going to start to go for those multiple offers situations as a marketing strategy, or is it just you put your home on the market and you sell it that day for your asking price? It looks kind of like it's kind of stopping there. Maybe with rates as high as they are, it's not going to be able to do what it did during COVID, where you're guaranteed to get 10 offers. I think right now we're sort of at a space where realtors, and I'm sure, I'm betting that there's some nodding heads in the room here, where you're discussing with clients, it's like, should we go for that or not? What's your number if we get a preemptive offer? Because it's a bit of a risk right now. It's not guaranteed that that offer day is going to go well. So let me show you something. This is, my son came home the other day, said, hey, my friend Jack is selling his house. So we went on realtor.ca and I looked at it. And as I was looking at the photos, I said, 580, that's way too low. That's wrong. So I went right to the listing and sure enough, hey, no conveyance of offers. That was the first one of these that I've seen in my area this year, or since, you know, more than a year ago. I said, wow, because I've been waiting for these things to see if they would start to pop back up this spring. Okay. And it's funny because their offer day was last Friday, and I actually met the dad in the parking lot up in Quebec somewhere. We were dropping off our Girl Guide daughters. And I said, hey, I heard you're selling your house. He said, yep, sold it last night. And I didn't pry too much. I didn't want him to think that I was creeping on his listing. But so he waited for that offer day and he was like, yeah, it went great. So I wonder what it sold for. I didn't inquire, but I suspect he did pretty well. And then there was this one too. I was showing this at the Ottawa Real Estate Board last Thursday. This was a house right near the Real Estate Board offices that I actually delivered papers to as a kid. I said, here's another one in my neighborhood. The second one of these I've seen. I said, $799. That's a big house. That was $1 million house 15 months ago. It's got to be about 9 now, I would think. 8's way too low. And sure enough, offers presented, seller reserves the right. And while I was talking after my presentation to a realtor about his clients considering taking a preemptive offer, bird in the hand, 2 in the bush, and all that, one of our new directors that I'm going to be meeting this afternoon, who I met, went back to his office, looked this up, and sent me this email saying, hey, Shaun, it already sold. So this is one example of a bigger home where they got their number, I guess, and decided. So I think that this really illustrates how we're at a tipping point right now, where this part of the market is starting to creep back in a little bit. And I wonder to what extent that could go further or sort of kind of get stuck where it is, hotter than it was a month ago, but still not COVID level, which is going to attract the attention of policymakers that I think we would rather not have. And so finally, I'll just leave you with this thought. If we don't start building, and people say, you know, if home prices go to 800, which I think they will, and then what if they go to 900 for an average home? How can the average Canadian afford this? The answer is they can't. And so what is going to happen is without the reaction on the supply side, on the housing stock side, to take this pressure off, you are going to see what we have seen over the last decade, which is the home ownership rate in Canada has peaked and it is falling, and it will continue to fall, and it will become a situation where, you know, I think we're a young country. You know, a generation ago, the house price was the house price. When my home first sold in 1958 for $27,000, it was the house price. Now people look at it and say, I can't believe that's $1 million home. And it's not. It's a $250,000 home on a $750,000 piece of land. And so this is a generational thing between home ownership and land ownership. But there are ways out of it by developing and redeveloping the missing middle and finding ways to increase supply. And so that's my slides for today, and that's my time. I think I overshot by 2 minutes. So sorry about that, Jason. So I will end my show and I will end my share, and I'll pass it over to Jason. I think we're going to do maybe a Q&A at the end if we have time. I can stay.
Yeah, for sure, Shaun. Thank you thank you very much for coming again. Very insightful. And no, you were bang on time. So I think I went over and I'm the culprit. So very good. So hang on till the end, Shaun, and I'd like to welcome Jason to join me on screen. So Jason is the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board's Chief Market Analyst and Director of Service Channels. He leads the market analysis program and oversees TREB MLS Service Department, as well as the delivery of information and data products to the TREB membership. Jason's going to be focusing on what's going on around the GTA and the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason. You can see your slides perfectly.
You can see them good. Okay. Well, I'll jump right in. And, you know, Shaun had shared his slides with me yesterday, although he didn't take me through the presentation. So I gave it a good guess as to what he was going to be saying with his map on his last slide. And I was pretty much right. He was talking about the fact that, you know, we've seen over time this persistent, constrained lack of inventory while we're seeing strong population growth, and obviously everyone needs a place to live. And the end result has been an erosion of affordability in a lot of markets across the country, including the Greater Toronto area and the broader Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so it's not surprising that when TREB goes out into the marketplace and does some consumer polling leading up to the mayoral by-election, that the issues that are top of mind are cost of living. Obviously, we've seen inflation in a lot of different segments of the consumer economy over the last couple of years. And then second to that is the affordability of housing. And really the two are intertwined. Because if we think about it, if your costs of living in other sectors are going up, then there's less money to put towards housing, which has also seen, you know, an erosion of affordability, not only because of strong price increases over the past number of years, but now, of course, in the face of a higher borrowing cost, certainly higher than what we were used to over the previous couple of years. And, you know, when we ask people, what are you concerned with? You know, 84% said, yes, we are concerned about our current ability to purchase a home. But I think even more so to the point that Shaun ended off on, you also saw people saying, well, we're concerned about future generations. So we know right now for our household, for example, you know, it's difficult to purchase a home, it's difficult to make those payments, etc. But we're even more concerned about our kids moving forward, because what does that mean? And there's an economic development imperative there, right? Because if we think right now we're seeing record levels of immigration into Canada, and certainly a great proportion of those newcomers are going to settle within the Greater Toronto area. But if we think sort of moving forward, if we can't house these people in an affordable fashion, and that's whether we're talking about the rental market or whether we're talking about the ownership market, obviously that's going to pose a problem for the overall economic development, not only of my region, of TREB's region, you know, but also the country as a whole. People will start looking elsewhere, and that doesn't mean in Canada. It could be in the United States, could be in other parts around the world. And so, it's important to get housing right, because there's lots of reasons why people want to move to Canada, but if you can't afford to live in Canada, then you start to look elsewhere. And so it's really important that we get this right. And the affordability of rental units. So, Shaun had mentioned that we're seeing a dip in the home ownership rate, and obviously that could continue moving forward. But again, what if there's nowhere to rent? It compounds the issue that, if I can't purchase a home, or my ability to purchase a home has been hampered, let's say, by high borrowing costs over the last year. Well, if we were having this discussion last year, we'd be talking about, well, no problem. We're going to see the cyclical shift out of the ownership market into rental. Well, rent what? I mean, we saw an initial spike in listings in the rental market. Some of that was policy based and what have you. But that's essentially been absorbed, and it was absorbed really, really quickly. And that's why we've been talking about, double-digit rent increases over the course of the last year. And obviously that's had now implications again for the ownership market. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. So let's talk about, the policy side of things, and credit where credit's due. Before I critique a little bit, it is important to note that if we were having this discussion, say 5 years ago, and Shaun's right, we've been talking about the missing middle housing, et cetera, for the better part of the last decade. But if we were having this discussion, say 5 years ago, we'd still see policymakers at all three levels of government focus on the demand side of the market. And we've seen that, while demand side policies can have a short-term impact on the market, long-term, if you don't get your house in order in terms of supply, you're not going to see a lot of movement. And so, we have seen policies on paper pointed towards getting more supply online, including the City of Toronto, where now, as of right, we can see that missing middle type housing be developed within neighborhoods throughout the city. The next step is going to be obviously getting shovels in the ground. And so to date, more than half the respondents to our survey, and this was done last month, so this is, current and up to date. It's what people are thinking about going into the election. And I'd argue that this type of thinking, this type of mindset permeates throughout the greater part of the GTA and even greater Golden Horseshoe. Is that 23% gave council D, 31% gave council F on dealing with housing affordability. I think the preconditions are in place. That if we look at this report card in a couple of years down the road, perhaps it'll look better because we are getting more housing online. But again, we need to turn policy on paper into shovels in the ground. It hasn't happened yet. Obviously, we hope it does sooner rather than later, because the population continues to grow in our region. And obviously, the great majority of the population is on side. They understand that we need to increase the supply of homes that are available. And people, I think, on the flip side, are starting to realize only 28% said we need to reduce the demand for homes. And we've seen various policy implementations over the last decade that have been pointed at demand, and they haven't had a sustainable result to improve affordability in our region. And so just jumping off the interest rate, I'll look at it through a slightly different lens than Shaun, because especially if we're thinking about affordability, at least in the short term, the increase in borrowing costs over the last year obviously had an impact on people's ability to purchase and pay for a home over the long term using a mortgage. And so if you look, I mean, we're essentially sitting at rates today that we hadn't seen since the first decade of the new millennium. But I think even more important than level is sort of thinking about the pace at which those rate increases came online. And you can see over the last number of Bank of Canada rate tightening cycles since the late 1980s, this was the most accelerated pace of rate increases on the part of the Bank of Canada over that period of time. And so it makes sense then, when we think about what we saw in terms of monthly sales in the Greater Toronto Area, so sales reported through TREB's MLS system in the GTA, how quickly things turned. So if you look at monthly sales back in February of 2022, February of last year, we're looking on an annualized basis of over 120,000 transactions a year, keeping on with that sort of record level that we had seen in 2021. But over the course of 6 months, we had halved that amount of transaction activity in our region, because it had such an immediate impact. That rapid increase in borrowing costs had such an immediate impact, both from an actual affordability perspective, so dollars and cents, people looking at what their mortgage payment would be vis-a-vis their income and whether or not they could afford it, but also a psychological impact, because obviously with this dip in sales also came a dip in pricing. And so once that starts, it's a bit of a vicious circle for a period of time, because people are thinking, well, I'm not going to buy into a falling market, et cetera. And what we found is that if you look back over the past number of interest rate tightening cycles, it takes a year to a year and a half for people, once they've moved to the sidelines, to come back into the market. And so, we saw that sideline activity really from, the summer of last year through to January or February of this year. And then, we did start to see that increase in sales activity, especially after the Easter weekend. That trend that Shaun pointed to did play itself out in the GTA as well. And so we did see quite an increase. And again, what's that sort of calculus? What's that mindset or thinking that people are going through as a rate tightening cycle comes online? Why does it take that year to a year and a half to start to see a rebound in the market? Because these are the types of decisions that people are looking at. So when we went out at the end of last year with Ipsos and polled people, what are the things that you're thinking about when you're deciding to purchase a home? All of this comes into play, the price of home you intend to purchase, and that obviously relates in a lot of cases to the type of home that you're looking to purchase, or near the bottom of the slide, the location of the type of home you're looking to purchase. And that takes time, because if in February of last year, when you could take on a mortgage at say 2.5%, you're thinking about buying a single detached home in the city of Toronto, and now you're looking at payments that have potentially doubled. Well, now maybe you're looking at a semi-detached home in a suburban region, 905 or 705 region surrounding the city, and that's obviously a big difference. So it takes time for you to sit back, talk with your family, sort of think about where you're now situated in the marketplace before you move back in and decide to purchase a home. And we're starting to see that now. We're starting to see people that have gone through this list of scenarios and are starting to move back into the marketplace. And obviously April was the first sort of big movement out of that sort of flatline period this year, and we do expect that to continue, but we have a ways to go, right? So this just ranks April home sales on a seasonally adjusted basis over the last decade or so, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. So obviously we saw a record year in 2021. We had a really bad April as we were going into COVID at the beginning of 2020. And we see the impact of OSFI as well. And not surprisingly, when you saw the OSFI stress test come online, that was a de facto interest rate hike, and a large interest rate hike, because now we're ratcheting it up dramatically, the qualifying rate. So it's not surprising that as the OSFI stress test came online, we were seeing sales at a similar level in 2018, to what we saw in 2022, and again in 2023. So there's a ways to go. But the market is improving. And part of the reason why there's still a ways to go is when we were asking people at the end of last year, well, how much would interest and mortgage rates, how much are they going to need to decrease in order to see you move back into the marketplace? And you see it's substantial, 100 basis point, 1 percentage point would see 11% of people move back into the market. You really got to get into that, sort of 2 percentage point range before you're seeing, a large number of those people that have moved onto the sidelines move back into the marketplace. And now we have seen some of this to a certain degree. We have seen borrowing costs decline on that fixed side. We have seen bond yields dip, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And so, some of the people within this red box have started to move back into the marketplace, and we started to see that in April. But for a lot of households, I'd argue, especially with prices starting to ratchet up again, a lot of people need to see borrowing costs even improve further before they start to get back into the marketplace, before we start to climb back to say more normal or average levels in terms of sales over the last decade. And so what needs to happen? Well, obviously we need to be confident that the Bank of Canada is confident that inflation is getting under control. And so, you know, since the beginning of last year, we started to see the Bank of Canada aggressively increase borrowing costs, and obviously the hope there on the Bank of Canada side is that that would lead to a pullback in consumer spending and we start to get inflation under control. And largely we have seen a downward trend, whether you're looking in the top chart at the annual change in inflation, we've seen that move closer to their 2% target, the line in blue. And on a month-over-month annualized basis, even more so. And I would say it's on this sort of monthly change that gave the Bank of Canada confidence that they said, you know what, we're going to put rate hikes on hold as we move through the first half of 2023. Unfortunately, we did have a little bit of bad news with the last inflation number, where we actually inched up in the other direction. Not a dramatic spike. Certainly, if you look at this, you know, take a step back and look at this chart, it certainly looks like inflation is still improved by either metric relative to where we were this time last year. But nonetheless, it gave people pause. It resulted in a bit of a rethink in terms of where interest rates were headed. And so back in April, if you looked at the yield curve, both for, you know, at April 6th, but also looking at the end of the 2023 and then the end of 2024, you know, it was pretty much baked in that we were going to start to see the Bank of Canada cut by 25 to 50 basis points this year, and then another 150 basis points next year. But as we saw a little bit more uncertainty around inflation, that outlook has changed. Shaun showed this in a little bit different of a view, but you know, now the odds are that, you know, we could see actually a bit of an increase, say a 25 basis point increase by the end of this year, but then start to see the Bank of Canada cut rates, but perhaps not as much by the end of 2024. The one similarity by both of these charts is that we have baked in, so credit markets have baked in the prospect of lower interest rates as we move forward over the next few years. And that can be seen in the difference between the shorter end of this yield curve, you know, 3 months to a year, and when you look at, say, that 5-year bond yield. And that's why I said earlier, you know, we have seen improvement on borrowing costs, especially on the fixed side, over the last few months, and certainly some home buyers have benefited from that. But there's a ways to go, you know, when we're thinking about borrowing costs and affordability for a lot of home buyers who may still be sort of wavering on the sidelines. But nonetheless, we've actually seen sales, especially in April, you know, jump above where our forecast was coming out of the year. And similar to Shaun, you know, we had expected a pretty decent improvement over the course of the year, but seeing it come on a little bit later in the spring. So this month, May, and into June. So it came a little bit earlier. So it remains to be seen. I agree that the May has been a strong month. Remains to be seen what really happens is sort of June, July. Do we account for that sort of first wave of people coming off the sidelines and then need to see rates drop a little bit, or will we continue to edge upwards? So we'll put a forecast update out after June of this year, just sort of giving a sense of where we stand. And I think the next couple of months are really going to tell the tale in that regard. And so even in the face of higher borrowing costs, why have we seen, you know, a decent improvement in the demand for ownership housing in the GTA? Well, number one, we haven't seen near as much of a hit on the economy as we might have thought this time last year. I mean, certainly as we started to see interest rates ratchet upwards, economic growth did slow down. You know, we saw a bit more of a flatlining in terms of the Canadian GDP trend, but it has been a little bit of volatile, and sometimes volatile to the upside. So, you know, when you look at this chart, it looks like, you know, the increase in borrowing costs, a bit of a step back in consumer spending, certainly a step back in the housing market did have an impact on the overall economy, but not as severe as some may have thought. Pretty resilient. And on top of that, you know, we didn't see any, you know, real change in the employment situation in the GTA over the last year. Still very, very tight. And so if you're sort of thinking about, well, I think I've come to terms with higher borrowing costs, you know, we may have to change up a little bit the type of home, the location of home, et cetera, that we're looking to purchase. But at the same time, I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident in the economy. I'm pretty confident in my ability to retain employment over the long term. So, you know, let's start thinking about jumping back into the market, and we're starting to see that more and more. And on top of this, we continue to see the population in the Greater Toronto Area grow very strongly. You know, so 2021 and 2022 were new record years in terms of immigration into Ontario, and certainly translating down into the Greater Toronto Area. And we expect to see this continue as we move through 2023 and beyond. And again, all of these people are going to require a place to live, whether you're talking about the rental market or whether you're talking about the home ownership market. And that's an important point, because while we thought a year ago that the rental market would be a bit of a relief valve in terms of housing new households moving to the Greater Toronto Area, as we've seen over the last number of quarters, the rental market has tightened up, the vacancy rate has been halved, and we continue to see double-digit growth in rents to the point where, you know, we've seen a real uptick in first-time buying intentions based on our Ipsos polling. Not back to where we were, say, 2015, 2016, but definitely up from where we were over the last, say, 2 to 3 years. And a lot of this has to do, again, with the fact that the rental market has tightened up. And so while average rents, say, for a condominium apartment in the GTA may not be the same as your mortgage principal and interest, property taxes, and maintenance fees, that gap is narrowing. And so you're getting more people saying, if I see much in the way of rent increases moving forward, I'm going to be thinking more and more about purchasing a home rather than renting, especially when you consider that even with higher borrowing costs today, a lot of your initial payment, even your first mortgage payment, is going to principal. And so to a certain degree, you're investing in yourself and investing in you know, the increase in the value of your home over time versus paying rent where you don't get to take advantage of that investment. And so, you know, why have housing market conditions in general continued to tighten? And Shaun mentioned completions on a national level, and I really like this chart where we kind of honed in on the aggregate number of completions, but then also drilling down into the type. And he's right. You know, if you think about the Greater Toronto Area and housing completions reported by CMHC, a lot of those completions certainly have been on the back of the condominium apartment market. So I'm going to take it one step further and sort of think about, well, you know, what do things look like in general? So if I just look at completions in the aggregate, at best, we've seen a flatlining trend, even with all of that condominium apartment construction. Yet at the same time, we know that the population has continued to grow strongly on the back of immigration. But the situation is actually worse than that, right? Because you need to net out all of those condominium apartments that are classified as ownership that actually find their way into the secondary rental market. And so if you back out, if you estimate the number of those units on net that are finding their way into the rental market, look what we've seen over the better part of the last 2 decades. We've actually seen, you know, a substantial decline in the number of completions that are making its way into that home ownership market. And at the same time, again, the population has continued to grow. And so how does that influence the resale market that I'm talking about? Well, with a lag of about 4 years, you tend to see new listings follow fairly closely the trend for completions. And, you know, this year has been especially alarming if you look at year to date, and if the year to date decline in new listings in the GTA holds up for the remainder of the year, you know, that's what things are going to look like. It probably improves a little bit on the back of stronger price growth, but nonetheless, you know, new listings this year are going to be lower than what we experienced last year. And that's going to be up against, you know, increasing demand. And part of the reason why, you know, we don't see an improvement in new listings, even with an increase in prices over the last number of years, is that people aren't confident in their ability to list their current home for sale and move into something that better meets their needs. And it gets back to, you know, home construction and housing completions in the aggregate versus seeing the diversity of home types we need to see come online to meet different housing needs as people move through their housing continuum. And that gets back to the charts that I was speaking about at the beginning, where there's dissatisfaction now from a policy perspective about, you know, how we've seen housing development unfold over the last couple of decades. And so how is this all translated through then? You know, on the one hand, we're starting to see an improvement in demand, and that'll continue on the back of strong population growth and a lack of rental supply to accommodate a lot of these households versus you know, listings available. And so, you know, jumping on the active listings trend for Canada as a whole, obviously not a dissimilar trend when we look at the GTA. And so thinking back between, you know, the beginning of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, we're actually seeing sales, you know, the total number of sales in a given month above active listings reported at month end during that period. And that's because we were essentially churning through new listings so quickly that we didn't see any meaningful increase in standing inventory of homes for sale. In fact, active listings were trending lower on a seasonally adjusted basis. And so this goes a long way to understanding why we're seeing that, you know, real strong run up in prices as we move through 2021. You know, supply wasn't keeping up at all. In fact, on a month over month basis, it was declining while demand remained at very high levels from an historic perspective. On the flip side, as we move through the initial phases of the Bank of Canada interest rate hikes, you know, we started to see a real dip in sales, that initial dip, and then that flatlining. And so we started to see a buildup again in active listings. Days on market increased, and so you started to see a buildup in inventory again. And that's, of course, why we saw prices trend lower as well. There's more to choose from. You all of a sudden realize that, you know, if 123 Jones Street, you weren't going to be able to get a deal done or couldn't come to terms on pricing, you had 456 Jones Street right down the road that maybe you could do a deal on. So the buyer, for the first time in a long time, was in the driver's seat from a negotiation perspective, and we did see prices edge lower as a result. Over the last couple of months, obviously that's changed. You know, and looking at April, and I'm sure again in May, we've seen this gap between sales and active listings start to shrink up. And eventually, you know, likely later this year, if these trends continue, you know, there'll be sort of an inflection point, or at least sort of, you know, in line with one another. And so we should expect to see continued price growth as we move through the remainder of this year as a result. And that's what we forecast. You know, we had zero confidence that we were going to see any kind of marked improvement on the supply side of that equation. And so, you know, as we started to see an uptick in demand, and that's already started, arguably it started earlier than we previously thought or forecast, you know, we're going to see a tightening in the market. We're going to see average prices start to trend upwards. The only ceiling, I'd say, in terms of pricing right now, given, you know, the tightening market, is that people still have to qualify. Right? And so with interest rates still at elevated levels, there could be a bit of a ceiling in terms of price growth just based on people's ability to qualify. And I think we'll get a better sense of that as we move through the summer and into the fall, where that stands, especially vis-a-vis, you know, where the Bank of Canada goes. There's a bit of uncertainty around inflation and whether we're going to see a bit of a ratcheted up in borrowing costs before we start to trend lower moving into 2024. And so again, you know, our price outlook has looked a little bit more in line with what our forecast was. And this gets back to my point around a bit of a ceiling around people's ability to qualify. I think there still is, you know, pretty conservative underwriting lending practices out there right now, because there is some uncertainty in terms of where we're going in terms of borrowing costs and just where we're going from an economic perspective. So we've actually seen pricing track quite well with our forecast so far. I think we could overshoot the blue line a little bit in terms of May, but we're making up for a little bit of a lost ground in January, February, and March of this year. So tracking pretty well in terms of where we thought prices would be going over the course of 2023. And so just sort of a final note. You know, all of you on this call today are realtors. There's about 1,000 of you, so certainly I'm looking forward to taking some of your questions. But, you know, realtor use and intentions to use a realtor still remains very, very strong, and I think that'll continue as we move into this sort of changing market where more and more realtors' advice in terms of positioning of a home for sale or in terms of a positioning of an offer will become more and more important. And not surprisingly, if you look at first-time buyer intentions to use a realtor, they're even higher because you have people that are sort of moving into the market for the first time. And as we saw, first-time buying intentions are up. They need your advice. They need access to your professional network of mortgage brokers and property inspectors, et cetera, in order to get their deal done. And more TREB member realtors are not only working within the Greater Toronto area, but they have a large footprint throughout the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And this just gets back to how the market has evolved over the past number of years. As we've seen that constrained supply of homes for sale, we've seen that fairly consistent uptick in home prices year over year. A lot of households have had to look further afield to meet their housing needs, and TREB member realtors have been there to help you do that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris, and certainly happy to take a few questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason. And if I could ask Shaun to come back on the screen. I love when you guys do your forecasts, because sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, and everyone expects that's what it is with the forecast. But here's an interesting question from from a realtor who's online. So I'll read it because it's well written. What about those who bought or refinanced in 2020, 2021, or 2022 at the lowest rate in history? The rates come up for renewal in 25, 26, and 27 at rates that potentially are where they are now or higher, and they cannot afford their homes. We could be facing a sustained market crash, could we not? Inflation and affordability is being underrated, in my opinions. Maybe I'll pass it to you first, Shaun.
Sure. So I would recommend going, and so I've been traveling, doing more of these in-person things, and certainly when I meet other analysts in the last year and a half or so, that's always what the question, that this is gonna, mortgage arrears are still basically on an all-time low. I think they ticked up by 1/100th of a percentage point. So we're not seeing that play out yet. What you can't see is the extent to which people's bank accounts that they sort of saved up during COVID are now being drawn down by if they've got a variable rate mortgage or if they've had to renew and those payments are that much higher. You can't see the vacation to Disneyland that doesn't happen. You don't see the dinners out that we don't do anymore. So yeah, it's definitely, I think it is a strain. And if there's a question around what that looks like going forward, the Bank of Canada in their most recent financial system review devoted quite a bit of time to mortgages and their concern about renewals in this year, next year, the year after, really going out to, they went all the way up to 2026. And we're sort of saying, okay, well, this is the percentage of people that are going to have to renew at a higher rate, which is pretty much everyone by 2026, except those that renewed it right at the beginning of 2022. But if you look at financial market expectations, I guess the sort of relief valve on that, hopefully a little bit, would be if by 2025, 26, the bank has wound rates back down somewhere around what would be considered neutral on that overnight rate, which is 2 to 3%, which is 200 basis points below where it is today. So that would be the hope, that inflation isn't sticky. To Jason's point about recent inflation numbers, one of the things I think the Bank of Canada was frustrated that markets got wrong in some of the recent inflation numbers is it's really easy to go, and we saw for inflation to go 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. But now what the concern is, you can't assume 3, 2. And now is it going to go like 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4? And that's the bank's real concern. And so maybe they're not done. And so it's all up in the air right now. This is the first inflation crisis we have had in the inflation targeting era. So everyone's doing this sort of, there's no what did we do last time? And so a little bit more uncertainty these days around that. And certainly that's a big concern of theirs.
Jason, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that, if you're taking on a mortgage in, the second half of 2020 and certainly as you move through 2021, your contract rate may have been, whatever, 2.5%, something like that. But at the same time, you're being stressed well north of 5. And I think to a certain degree that stress test, while, we didn't like it, it did put us in better stead moving forward. And we've seen fairly tight labor market conditions. We've seen people's income's rising. And so to a certain degree, if we're looking 2024, 2025, the expectation is rates will be lower today or then versus where they are today. And so while they may be higher certainly than those contract rates from that period of time, presumably people would have been able to handle that, presumably do the stress test initially, and then their situation will change likely for the better as well.
Great. Let's hope they come down. So another question, and I'll start with you, Jason, because this is a topic you and I have talked about over the last 5-7 years. So, how is the current interest rate and market impacted the investors who are buying investment properties, as well as the foreign buyers? I know we've done a lot of studies on that in the past. So,
yeah, well, I think in general, we've seen a few stories come out this week, comparing, the cost of carrying say a condominium apartment as an investor and renting it out. And, there's a mismatch, by and large, looking at pricing right now, looking at interest rates and what your monthly payment's going to be on top of taxes, on top of, maintenance fees, you're likely having to inject some of your own money each month in order to cover all those costs, even with higher rents that we've seen over the last little bit. So obviously that's had an impact in terms of that investment. And some investors are saying we are considering selling their investment units, and I think that raises the alarm in terms of the affordability in the rental space and the availability of units in the rental space, because we haven't seen the stock of rental accommodation in the Greater Toronto Area grow over the last decade, but for investor-held condominium apartments, right? And so if all of a sudden some of those units could be exiting and say making their way back into the ownership market, and then that sees tighter rental market conditions. That sees more of those people that otherwise would have chosen to rent move directly into the ownership market, because they don't see the sense in paying rent and not taking advantage of that principal pay down and then growth in that investment over the longer term. And the problem is on either side of that coin, more and more we're not seeing supply keep up with demand, supply keep up with population growth. And so you see there's a real interconnectedness. We can talk about the rental market. Well, we haven't seen purpose-built rental construction to any great degree over the last decade, and so that fell at the feet of investors, and often vilified. The investor has really supported rental demand over the better part of the last decade, and now the scenario shifted a little bit, and some of those investors are having second thoughts, and it's a problem.
Shaun, anything further to add?
I think if you call yourself a landlord, you probably could it'd be a good time for a rebrand. When I was in my 20s, one of my criteria for renting was always an older landlord who owned the building, and then you just be a really good tenant. But yeah, you're going to see, to Jason's point, like people that get into trouble that are going to try to pass those rent increases onto their tenants, which we're seeing. And also to Jason's point, $4,000 a month mortgage doesn't look so crazy when your rent's $3,500. So it was always clear from last year when rates started going up, but for us, when we could go and look and see what financial markets were expecting, when 5-year fixed rates took a lot of that on right away, that the housing market, the resale market that we measure was going to crater, and that all of that demand wasn't going anywhere. It was just going to swirl around in the rental market. And so the concern now, at least with the housing market coming back a little bit, is it's going to take maybe a little bit of that pressure off, because the question is, it's one thing to fall at the bottom of the housing market and be stuck in the rental market. Another thing entirely to fall at the bottom of the rental market. And we already have a homelessness crisis in this country. So I think that's the next thing to drop here, unfortunately.
Yeah. Great. And the last question that I'm going to have to ask myself, because it's related about it's an assessment related question. So we've got a couple on why was the reassessment canceled and what happened to the phase-in. So these are good questions, and I'll just take a moment to cover it. So we were scheduled to complete the next reassessment in 2020, and we were ready to go. We had our valuation models ready, but with the pandemic, the government decided that, hey, let's not go through the middle of a reassessment during the pandemic, which was a smart move because there's a lot of work that and a lot of dealing with people when we're in the midst of a reassessment. So as Nicole stated, we are still waiting on the government to announce the next reassessment date. And the reason there's no phase-in is we were at the end of the cycle, of the phase-in cycle. So all of the values remain at the 2016 assessed values, and until the government announces the next reassessment and we figure out what the valuation date and what they're going to do with the phase-in, that's all to come. That's what we're waiting to hear. There won't be anything for next year. Next year will be status quo, and we'll keep waiting for what's to come. So with that, I'd like to thank both you, Jason and Shaun, for presenting again today. Great presentations. We've always got great feedback from them, and hope to see you guys in person soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of today's session, so I'd like to leave you, everyone, it's a bit of a reminder that we do have free training for all Ontario Realtors. Last year alone, we did, there's Ashley's cat. Last year alone, we did over 260 sessions across the province, and we're already blowing through that number this year already. So we've got about 5 different training sessions. We've got webinars, which we email to everyone on our mailing list on a monthly basis. And we are doing in-person sessions. So your real estate boards book us in, brokerages book us in. If you're interested in having an in-person session, you can email us at propertyline@mpac.ca, and one of our team members will get back to you and see if you can schedule something. I will say the demand is very high, and we're already scheduling into the fall. But again, we've got the webinar series, which runs on a weekly basis. So now I'd just like to remind you that when you exit the go-to presentation today, you're going to have a survey, and if you fill out the survey, you're going to get a coupon emailed to you for a free AVM comparable report. So I hope you take us up on that offer, as well as we'll be emailing out the recording and presentations later on this week. So watch for that in your email. And again, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.